But we are in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1. And you, so this is the plural, and you, or all of you, were dead. So circle it. And you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked. Circle walked. Following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived. How did we live that way, Paul? We lived that way in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature, circle nature, and were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind. Wow! That's all I'm going to be able to get through today. It's going to be heavy enough, so that's where we're going to stop. How many of you guys have kids? Oh, wow. So between the first service, which is a bunch of old people, and then the second service, which is a little less old people, as we get later on Sunday, it gets younger and younger. The services get younger and younger. First service had the old crusty people like myself. Second service is kind of a mixture, and it kind of gets younger from there. But it's interesting that for those of us that have kids, or maybe you're raising your grandkids or whatever now, or you remember back to those days, it's tough to raise kids. It's tough to raise children. And for those of us that grew up in the 70s or cut our teeth growing up in the late 60s, 70s, by the time you and I were kind of getting older, as far as like 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, if you were anywhere in that range in the 70s, by that time in psychology, there was the idea that people are basically good. They just need to be helped sometimes when they choose poorly. Because by the time the 60s and 70s rolled around, they had deeply entrenched ideas about human nature. And Freud, from the early 1900s, deeply influenced the way that you're even being taught to this day about how you process and act in the world. And one of the things that came out in the 70s, which I'm a child of that age, was, and I even remember this being younger, is the idea that we don't spank our kids anymore because really they don't need to be kind of punished for what they do. They kind of just need to think about what they've done. And that's why we have this thing called go sit in the corner or a timeout. Or now we've evolved to like the safe space where, I need my safe space where no one can talk to me or make me feel bad or do anything that makes me feel uncomfortable. But understand, where we are today is a direct result of where we were kind of at in the 60s and 70s. But previous to that, there was a whole bunch of psychological work that brought us to the point of like, hey, your kids basically are good. They just need to be helped to make better choices. And here's a problem, is none of that stinking worked. Is your kids, you realize, I don't need to just sit him in the corner. There's something wrong with my kid. He always makes the wrong choice. She always does the thing that's selfish. She says the thing she knows is going to hurt me, and she says it anyway. And if you've ever worked with kindergartners, if you've ever worked with 5, 6, 7-year-olds, here are kids who have just started living. They've hardly been influenced by anything or anybody. And all of a sudden, you have to keep people from stealing. You have to keep Johnny from poking people in the eyeball. And he knows it hurts him. And he likes it. You have to keep people from saying hurtful things or doing hurtful things. And you go, why is it that I can't just tell my kid that's unacceptable? And have the kid go, oh, you know what, that's true. I apologize. I shouldn't have, I already knew it was that way, and I just need to change how I feel. Why doesn't that work? The Bible actually speaks to that exact thing. Why hasn't psychology realized the problem? Because the Bible's going to speak to something that is spiritual, not mental or physical. Listen, it's the true driver of your behavior. I'm going to speak of something that literally directly affects you right now. Or if you're going to have kids in the future, how you'll raise your kids. Or if you're older, why your grandchildren are crazy and insane. So let's look at it this morning. Number one, we were dead as we walked. We were dead as we walked. After Paul described, so Paul wrote the book of Ephesians, the Apostle Paul. After Paul described the amazing relationship that the Ephesians had with God through Jesus, which he did all through chapter 1, which we've looked at the last few weeks, he recalled their former state. In other words, what they were like before they came to know Jesus. Before Jesus, they were dead. So look at Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1. And you were dead. Circle dead if you haven't circled it yet. In your Bible, right next to dead, write the word nekros, which is Nekros. So we get, the word corpse comes from the Greek word that's dead in your Bible. So Ephesians was originally written in Greek. The Greek word for dead there is nekros. And it's interesting that that's the same word you would use if you died. You're a corpse. Your life has left you. And so Paul's saying something really weird here. It's like he's saying it in the past tense, but you were dead. What does that even mean? How can you be past tense dead? Well, Paul's going to explain that to us. Before Jesus, they and us today were dead in the way we lived our lives. How many of you guys ever watch Walking Dead on AMC? Anybody watch Walking Dead? Okay, like 5 people are going to be willing to say they've watched. Okay. Well, here's the idea of this show if you don't know it. So these are all actors, and they spend hours and hours before each show getting this makeup put on them. And their idea on the show is this, that part of the population has this issue where they've died, but they're not really dead. They kind of are still alive, but they're not kind of really human anymore, and they're kind of this in-between, we are alive, but we're dead. And the name of the show is literally The Walking Dead. And so the idea is there's true living people, like me and you, who are trying to survive in a world that has these zombies-ish things walking around. And so the writers of this show have to keep on trying to come up with ways that these things keep living. Because they're dead, but they kind of still walk around. They're the walking dead things. And it's interesting that this Ephesians chapter 2 is 2,000 years old, and Paul talks about the exact same thing that the writers of this show are writing about in our day and age, except instead of a physical reality, he's talking about a spiritual reality. He goes, you were dead, nekros, in the way that you lived your life. What does that mean? How can you be a live person but dead? Is it like this? No, it's actually not like this. It's actually worse. So let's look at it. This meant that all their actions, even things they or their culture considered good, quote unquote, was valueless before God. So I'm going to drop some knowledge to you. Everybody get ready. Buckle up because it's going to be a little bit of a bumpy ride this morning. If I was to say to you, are you a good person? A majority of us, if not our whole culture, would go, I'm a good person. I am a good person. Do you do bad things once in a while? You'd go, yeah. Once in a while I do bad things. I'm not a bad person, but I do some bad things once in a while. Well, like what? What does that mean? Well, once in a while I'll go 56 miles an hour in a 55 zone. We're at the buffet, it says, just take 1 brownie. I might take 2. So in other words, I'm not a killer. I'm not a child murderer. Like, those are bad things. I would just say myself, I'm not bad, I'm good, but I just do some off things once in a while. So, okay, how would you stop then? Let's just say you are good. How would you stop forever doing that wrong thing? I don't know. I don't know how I would forever stop doing that wrong, bad thing in my life. The Bible actually speaks of it more accurately, and it speaks of it this way. You are not a good person doing a few bad things. You're actually a bad person that does good that your society recognizes as good once in a while. And here's what I mean. Ready? Buckle up. Buckle up, because the road's going to get bumpy for a little bit. Here's what I mean. So, pre-Jesus, I love philosophy. And I ran in a lot of philosophical circles. And we'd run into guys that were atheistic. Like, I don't even believe there's a God. Why don't you believe there's a God? Because I believe science explains everything, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Well, if science explains everything, then where does morality come from? Well, what do you mean? I mean, like, where does the idea that if I murder a child, that would be bad versus me helping the child across the street from getting hit by a car? Like, the difference between those two, who decides what's good or bad? Here's the problem you come up with if you're an atheist or an agnostic that lives as an atheist, is this problem. Somebody has to decide what's right and wrong, what's good and bad. Are they shades of just what's good or bad, or is there a true standard? Because the issue is, if there is no God, then I've got nobody telling me that anything's really wrong. So if I murder somebody because it makes me happy, then that should be okay for me, because what's right for me should be okay, because nothing's telling me that anything's wrong. And people, of course, can't live that way. So they go, no, no, no. If you hurt somebody else, then that's wrong. Oh, wait a second. How can you tell me what's wrong if there's nobody telling us what's wrong? So if you would say, well, society just kind of makes up the rules. Okay. So in Germany, it was okay to murder homosexuals and handicap people, mental or physical, or Jews. They gassed them by the millions. So is that society okay to decide what's right and wrong and good and bad? Well, no, that's not okay, because our society was repulsed by that. So much so we went to war. But why should our society tell their society they were wrong if there's no God saying everybody should know this is wrong? I'm getting excited, because here's the reason. If you don't believe there's a God, you absolutely have no standard to tell anybody else what's right or wrong. Because it's not a society that decides, or else you can't say a society's wrong. Every society should be able to live what they see as right. If they want to kill Norwegians, they should be able to kill Norwegians if I'm living in Germany. And nobody else should say, that society shouldn't do that. Why? Because every society makes up what's right and wrong. But we know that's not true. Why do we know that's not true? Because God has implanted in all people, in all places, the idea of right and wrong. Immediately when you're an atheist, you cannot explain the groundwork for morality that supersedes all people in all cultures. Atheism doesn't work for morality at all, at any level. So here's the reason I tell you that. When you have a child, you immediately know there's a true thing called a sin nature. Because you wouldn't need to train your child not to be selfish, not to poke him in the eye, not to tell a lie, if you were basically good, but you just kind of do some bad stuff. Because you realize from the moment they're born, they're self-focused, all about me. Change my diaper, you right now. Why don't you change your diaper? You got your own hands. Because I haven't been trained right. Okay. But as you see your kid start to grow, you realize, wow, there's something wrong with my kid. He's not doing a bunch of good stuff. Mom, how can I help? Your kid is continually about self. You have to discipline your kid not to be about self. Why is that? Because the nature is self-focused from the day you're conceived. The Bible would say this: you're not a good person doing bad things. You're a bad person that does some good things that your society looks at and goes, you're a good person. But that doesn't mean that God thinks what you do is good. It's a societal decision that it's better to bless children than kill them. That's what society might come up with, but that doesn't necessitate the fact that you're a good person. It means that you just do some good things that a society says those are pretty good. So how can we be truly good before God? And that's what Paul's going to deal with right here. Let's look at it. Good is subjective to people. We decide kind of what's good in our society. But it's objective to God. Woo! I ran right over the top of some of you. You're already sleeping. You're thinking about lunch. Listen to what I'm saying. Good is subjective to people, but true good is objective to God. God knows what real good is. So how can we know what real good is if we've never been good? That's what Paul's saying. We were dead. How can you be past tense dead? That means that now you're alive. So before you were spiritually dead, but physically alive. You did things that you knew were wrong and you liked it. Even though you lived your life physically alive, you were dead to God. You didn't do good. You didn't do true good. You did evil because you liked it. You did things against God. You did things you knew were wrong. Why do we do that? Because we have a nature that says, I want what I want. And I don't really care what anybody else thinks, including God. Paul described their actions as trespasses. Look at Ephesians 2. Verse 1 says, and you were dead in your trespasses and sins. Two different Greek words, and here's what it means. Listen to me. The first word, trespass, means you know it's written down and you don't want to follow it. Let me give you an example. How many of you guys have ever trespassed on someone else's property and there was a sign right in front of you? Everybody better put their stinking hands in the air because you've done it. Remember when you were like 12 years old and you saw this beautiful stream running and it was just on the other side of this barbed wire fence? And you're like, oh, dude, I want to go swimming. I want to go get in that water. It's 150 degrees in Temecula and there's a stream. Here's the thing. It's not going to hurt anybody. I'm going to get in this water. No one's going to care. It's not a big deal. Whoever owns this property, if they were here, they'd probably let me do it anyway. So you make up your own rules in your head when the sign stinking says, no trespassing. Trespassers will be shot. And if you survive, you get shot twice. And you're like, man, I don't care. You get buck naked, which is also illegal. And you go through the barbed wire fence and go get in the stream. Why would you do that? You don't own the property. You don't know why you shouldn't be in that water. It might be poisonous for all you know. You have no idea. It could be snakes in there. That sign could be protecting you. You have no idea. Why did you do that? You did it because you wanted to and you didn't care what the rules were. And that's the same idea here. When he says trespasses, he means there are rules that you know you're not supposed to do, but you do them anyway. It's like the 10 Commandments. There are physical rules that go, don't sleep with that guy's wife. And you go, I don't really care. I'm not in love with my wife. I'm going to go sleep with her anyway. Don't steal. Now, my company doesn't pay me enough, so I'm just kind of making up for it by taking this computer paper home. Don't lie about that. Well, I'm going to really hurt her feelings if I tell her the truth about that thing. So it's better. It's better if I lie in this situation. And here's the point. Trespasses in this verse means you knew it was wrong. You knew it was wrong. It's written down wrong. Don't do that thing and you go, I'm going to do it anyway. Why? Because I'm making up my own rules as I go. That's called evil. When you know what's wrong and you do something different. When you know it's 65 speed limit and you say, but the flow of traffic. I mean, my Ferrari does 65 in first gear. I mean, give me a break. I can go 165 in this car, and it's not going to affect anybody. And we make up our own rules. We go, I know what's true, but gosh, not for me. And the other word is sins, trespasses and sins. And sins is the umbrella that everyone knows is right and wrong. Paul described their actions as trespasses against God's written laws and sins, which are violations of God's overall moral standards that all people are aware of. Look at Romans 2, verses 14 and 15. The same guy that wrote Ephesians wrote Romans, Paul. And he wrote this to the church at Rome. For when Gentiles, so that's me, I'm a Gentile, so like I'm Norwegian, I'm not Jewish. All people, all non-Jews are Gentiles everywhere in the whole world. For when Gentiles who do not have the law, which is basically the 10 Commandments and beyond, by nature, there it is, boom shaka, by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves even though they don't have the law. We don't have the 10 Commandments up on a rock in the North Atlantic. If you live in Iceland or you live in Norway, where my ancestors are from, we didn't have the Mosaic law. So how can we know what's wrong? Paul says, you already know what's wrong because it's written on your heart. Verse 15, they show that the work of the law, in other words, what the law is trying to get done, which is keep you from sinning against God, is written on their what? It's written on your heart. While their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts then accuse or even excuse them. Ready? I'm about ready to lay some theological knowledge right in your head. You don't have an excuse. You're like, what about the people that live in the middle of the jungle? They know there's a God, and they know what's right and wrong. How would they know that if they don't have the Mosaic Law? If they don't have the Bible, how would they know that? Bam! It's literally written on their hearts. You have a moral nature whether you live in the middle of Africa or the middle of Russia or the middle of Temecula. The law is actually written inside of you. It's your conscience that goes, don't do that thing. Why would you steal that? You know that's wrong. Your kids even know it's wrong and they still do it. They steal from you. They steal right out of your purse. You would have given them the money, but they'd rather steal it anyway. Why would your kids do that? And they know it's wrong. Because they have an orientation that says, I know best about my own life. Don't make me follow what you want me to do. I'm going to make up my own rules. I'm God to myself. It's called sin. It's called wickedness. Paul says, you were once like that. Before Jesus. Ready? Nothing helps you appreciate where you are like looking back at where you've been. I love this about Paul. He goes, hey, you know what? You were dead. And you know what you were like pre-Jesus? It was ugly. All you looked for was getting high and sleeping with a lot of babes and making a lot of money and going, I'm kind of the man, or I'm the woman that runs my own life. Nobody tells me what to do. But what we didn't realize when we were like that was we were alive physically, but we were dead and rebellious toward God. We thought we were good. We thought we were a good person just doing some bad stuff, but the Bible actually says the opposite of that. You're actually an evil person that loves to do your own thing. You do some good things, but it's our society saying you're a good person, not God. That's like, you can tell people, if they go, hey, I really don't like the way you are. This is what you tell them. Well, if you don't like the way I am now, man, you'd really hate the person I was before. Because, man, nothing makes you appreciate what God's doing now in your life than looking back to who you used to be. You look back at your old pictures from college and you go, Jesus almighty help. I don't even remember taking that picture. Wow, I must have been hammered out of my mind. And you go, God, how did I get home that night? Alive. Sometimes it's just the straight mercy of God in our lives. When we look back at some of the stupid things, or like when a flashback from Facebook from like 10 years ago or whatever, you're like, whoa, that's in public? Yeah. And I love that Paul does this. For a whole chapter in Ephesians 1, he goes, isn't it awesome to live for God? And then in chapter 2, he goes, but wait, let's look back at who you used to be. And so chapter 2 is like an Ephesians flashback from their previous life. And he goes, you weren't a good person that did some bad stuff. You were a person that loved wickedness, but you kind of did some things to make yourself feel better about yourself that you called good. Number 1, we were dead as we walked. Number 2, we were dead as we followed. So Paul makes this point in Ephesians that we are following something. Nations follow this feeling, and nobody can really hammer it down on what it means. But Paul actually speaks of it. All cultures, African cultures, Russian cultures, American cultures, South American cultures, every culture there is, has a value system made up by leaders of those nations who either directly or indirectly enforce their own values. As all cultures and nations are led by sinful people, humanity in general and individuals in specific fail to meet God's standard of perfection. Paul calls this the power of the air, or a worldwide sin orientation. This isn't neutral, but it's influenced by satanic realities, causing nations to hate their own people, hate other nations, and even hate God himself. Wow, this is going to be something some of you have never even thought of. Listen to me. So I studied history. Those of us that have ever studied history, we like to read history or past realities of nations. Has it ever bothered you that why in the world hasn't nations gotten better? If you read back into Greek history or Roman history or the pharaohs of Egypt or Norse mythology. You read back into African history, all these histories, and you go, man, we have thousands of years of recorded history, and we're still not better. Why do we keep butchering each other? Why did nations go to war? Why in the world don't we have this euphoria of a worldwide, like, hey, we've learned our lesson? You want to know something crazy? Over the last 100 years, more people have died as a result of war and genocide than in all of history combined. Atheistic communism has killed hundreds of millions of people, of their own people. Hundreds of millions. So we go, why don't cultures get better? Why haven't we learned from thousands of years of history? I can tell you why. Because sinful people run sinful nations. And until sinful people change their sinfulness and honor God, you will always get cultures and nations that ultimately hate God because they're run by people who don't follow God. So if you've got leaders that don't follow God and people that don't follow God, you literally have nations that continually do the same thing over and over. We kill people. We go to war. We hate people. They're a different skin color than me. They think differently than me. They're younger than me or older than me. We hate people without even knowing them. Why do we do that? Because we have a sin orientation that says, I know better. My prejudice and my hatred of other people is really what God thinks too. That's the reason we do those things. And Paul says this, nations are under this sense of satanic oppression where we don't learn from past history because why do we continually repeat dysfunction? Because the people at the top don't follow God. Everybody still with me? I don't care what political party you are. It doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're independent, Republican, Democrat, tree hugger, whatever. It doesn't matter. Because if you don't have people that love God, period, you don't have a nation that will even remotely have rules that follow God. So this isn't even political. This is a heart issue. Without Jesus, people are sons of disobedience, not only following sinful leadership, but willingly participating in it. This clash of clans is the tension between the family of God and the family of Satan, of light, of darkness, of righteousness, and evil. How many of you guys are Western movie lovers? Have Western movie lovers in here? Okay. And you guys ever seen the movie Tombstone? Probably. There we go. Now I know righteousness exists in this room. Okay. One of my favorite movies. Not godly movie at all, but it does depict something about the West. Okay? So here's a shot from that movie. And you've got Doc Holliday, who used to be a dentist, who was also a sharpshooter, on the far left, played by Val Kilmer. And you got these three over here. These three are all brothers. And they're actually the sheriffs of a town called Tombstone. You can go visit it today in Arizona. It still exists. It was a mining town in the late 1800s. They are the Earp family. And they, who were not really much better than anybody else, they were pretty much as wicked as anyone else, but they happen to have a badge. And so this Earp family actually goes to clannish war between two other families, which is the Clantons and the McLowrys. And they were kind of called the cowboys, and they would rustle cattle, and they would do a bunch of evil things. So the whole point of the movie Tombstone is a battle really between two family groups or three family groups. And it's this clash of clans that happens. And I want you to realize something. In the same way in 1881, that happened in Tombstone is the same thing that happens in spiritual reality. There's a thing called the gunfight at the OK Corral. It's the most famous gunfight in history. And you can actually go visit it if you travel through Arizona. And what happened between these clans was they had a gunfight at the OK Corral. And people died there. And what happens when you have families that fight or clans that fight is people die. And until there's forgiveness, there's a continual cycle of bloodshed. Watch this. And it's even worse if one of the family members jumps into the other family. like marries a daughter of the other family, that son is hated by the family that he left. And it's the same thing spiritually. Watch. You and I, when we are born, we have a slant towards self. It's called sin. We think we're good, but we're not. We need to change who we are. We are influenced by our culture. We're influenced by Twitter. Instead of going to God's word, we go to our girlfriends that'll say the same thing that we want them to tell us. Who will say something that I want to hear? Those are the people that we go to. Yeah, you know what? He doesn't love you. You need to sleep with somebody else. Oh, your wife? Oh, man, she's lame. Then find the hot girl at work. You deserve better. You know what? You're a good person. You deserve more. And we kind of go, you know what, Oprah? You're right. I do deserve more. No, you don't. What you do deserve is hell, because you and I, we hate God. The things we know are wrong, we do them. But because God is so loving to us, he doesn't give us those things. And we're going to look at that next week. But first I want to look at the front end of what it means to not love God, because that's where Paul's going. And he says, man, there's a clash of clans. We belong to the other family. We belong to the family when we were born that hates God. And we warred against God. And we did things we knew were evil and wrong. And what we needed was actually to join a new family. And guess what? When you join another family, the family that you came from hates you, because you left who you were. Look at this. People voluntarily follow those who promote their values. You want to know why our culture chases after ungodly things and calls it good? Because our leaders go, these are the things that are important, and we kind of go, you know what, you're right. You know that the United States listen to me, the United States by population has the highest percentage of people who would call themselves Christians in the world. Walk with me. You can't go to another country that has as many people as the United States does and has a higher percentage of people who would call themselves Christians than the United States in the whole world. So why do we do things that don't line up with Christian teaching? Because technically the majority believe in Jesus, and Jesus is found in the Bible. So why don't we do that? Because number one, not everybody who claims to be a Christian actually is a follower of Jesus. They're just a label. They're like a bumper sticker on a car. Bumper stickers don't change the nature of the car. And number two, Christians that know what's true don't want to speak up because they don't want to seem bigoted, or we live in a culture of fear now. So ironically, the culture that says, don't be a bully, now bullies everyone. It's unbelievably ironic that the culture that goes, we hate bullying, all of a sudden goes, did you say that? Don't say that. We shout people down on Twitter. We shout people down. We call them haters, and people just speak in their minds. We live in a free country where you're able to speak your mind. But when you speak your mind, you're shouted down as a hater by people who hate you. We theoretically call our society the one that goes, we hate bullying, but then we bully people who actually speak up, even if we don't like it. But that's the country we live in. You're allowed to do that. And here's what happens to Christians, is now when we are able to speak up and go, I think that's inappropriate, or I don't think that's godly, now people are afraid. We're afraid of being bullied online. We're afraid of somebody speaking against us or showing up at our work or whatever. Ironically, the anti-bully culture has created the greatest bully culture in the history of the United States, because now people are afraid to speak unless it's what other people want them to hear. That's what's called the people at the top, the culture makers, deciding what everybody should believe. That's the spirit of the age. The Germans call it Zeitgeist. Any Germans in here? Where my Germans at? Okay. Zeitgeist basically means the spirit of the age. What is that feeling you get from living in a culture? And we feel pressure to live the way our culture wants us to live, not the way God wants us to live. Lastly, we were dead as we lived. We were dead as we walked. We were dead as we followed other people who did the same things we wanted to. But until we left those clans, We still did what our culture wanted us to do, which was against God. And number 3, we were dead as we lived. Paul told the Ephesians the reason they acted wrong and followed the wrong was because they were living wrong. While they were alive physically, they were dead spiritually. Listen, humanity at its core is self-focused and self-righteous. It's the reason you got to discipline your kids. It's the reason psychology will never give you the answer to a nature problem. Listen to me. It's not a behavior. If you're going into psychology, because I was going to be a psychologist when I was starting out in high school, when I was starting out in college. And the thing I could never get to was, why do people act bad? Why do we have to keep doing therapy? Why do we have to keep doing this stuff? I'll tell you why. People don't need a change of behavior. People need a change of nature. And when you change their nature, you'll change their behavior. If you try to just change the behavior before you change the nature, you're going to keep having to go after the behavior because the nature keeps on doing the behavior. That was totally free. Look at this. From Adam's original sin, all of us are born with a spiritual cancer of a rebellion against God, which produces physical and spiritual death. This permanent disposition makes all people enemies of God and children of wrath. Listen, ready? Let me help you. People don't just do wrong, they are wrong. The reason you do wrong isn't because you're a good person that slipped up. It's because you're an evil person that wants to do what you want to do, not God's way. You want to do it your way. You just do good once in a while. Listen, ready? I'm going to give our culture a theological enema. We need to clean out the trash that decades of psychological junk has been brought into our lives, which is basically you're good, you just do a few bad things. No, it's not. The reason you can't change yourself is because your nature's wrong. The reason we got to have jails is because people can't get their act together. Why can't they get their act together they can't even follow the law. Why is that? Because your nature is in rebellion. We love rebellion. It's the reason we hide our sin online. It's the reason we do things in the dark and at night rather than right out in the middle of the day in the Promenade Mall. Because we love our sin and we coddle it and we hold it and we feed it. Why do we love our sin? Because our nature's wrong. And until Jesus transforms us, we will always be wrong. Paul doesn't say, you're kind of alive in your trespasses. He goes, man, you're a living dead person. Even while you're alive, you do the wrong thing. Why? Because your nature needs to change. And guess what? Next week we'll talk about that. But this week we talk about the bad. Next week, we talk about the glorious side of following Jesus. So if you're going, dude, that was really encouraging. I feel like going home and just calling it a day. Next week, we talk about the glories of following Jesus. But first off, we got to figure out where we truly are, because we've been lied to our whole lives. The inborn nature creates the heart or the will from which flows our desires that influences our ability, producing the sinful actions. Ready? I leave you with this. The fruit is the direct result of the root. Woo! Guess what? You don't like the fruit you get on a tree? Don't curse the fruit. That means you planted the wrong tree, son. You're like, why do I keep getting figs on this stupid tree in my backyard? I'll tell you why, because you planted a fig tree. I could have swore I planted an apple tree. No, you know how you know what tree you planted? Is when you look at the stinking fruit, and you don't get mad at the fruit going, gosh, I really hate this fruit. I'm going to kick this fruit. No, you know what you do? You chop down the tree and get rid of the roots, because until you get rid of the roots, you're going to get the same fruit. And we need to stop living in this quasi, I'm a pretty good person mode. You're not a pretty good person. You need Jesus to transform your heart, because when you change your nature, you'll change your actions. You don't just keep on focusing on the actions. That's why we have to have jails, because people won't get their hearts changed. They just want somebody else to tell them what's right and wrong and force them to live in a little box until they get their act straight. We need those kinds of things because our hearts are not slanted towards God, they're slanted towards wickedness. And watch, ready? The further you get away from God, the more evil looks correct. That's why we have God's word. That's why God didn't get you just the idea of just trust your feelings. Why does he give us his word? Because it's a stake in the ground that goes, here's truth. And if you don't follow God's word, you start sliding away from God's word, and evil starts to look right. It's the reason that when you look back on your life, you go, man, I used to follow God back here. Now I don't even know if that's even true anymore. Because you've gone so much down your own path, now you think you're right, and God's wrong. That's the quintessential definition of evil. Because God decides what's good. When we start deciding, or our culture decides, you could be living in evil and call it good. Because you're so far from God, you can't even remember what's true. Don't hate the fruit. You got to change the root. You change the root, you'll get different fruit. It'll be fruit that'll please you. It'll be fruit that pleases God. It'll be fruit that fills your life with peace and joy rather than regret.